Hi, my name is Bradley Isaac. I'm an Associate Director in the Structured Finance team in Sydney. Today, I'm going to take you through a demo of Fitch's RMBS ResiGlobal asset model. So today, I'm going to give a quick run through of the model, how to populate it, how to run it, and how to interpret the results. So in order to download the model, you can either go to the address or follow the link. Click Download Now. So you'll need to enter your contact details and in particular your email, because this will send through a download link in order to access the model. So if we submit that, we'll go to our email, we'll get an email here with the download link. Now I won't make you watch me download the model. So I've downloaded it in advance and I will show you how to use it. If we download the model, you'll find it in your download folder. It's labeled ResiGlobal in this version -3-90-0, and it's in a zip folder. So in order to use it, we need to extract it. Let's quickly do that. And when that's completed, you'll have a new folder here called ResiGlobal. Now in here, there are three files that we're interested in. So the first is the ResiGlobal guide. So let's double click that. So the ResiGlobal guide has a couple of key documents or information for us. The first is if we click on documentation, and you can either choose Word or PDF. And this documentation file will give a brief run through of the model, again, how to populate it, how to run it, and some frequently asked questions. So if you're needing help running the model, this is a good place to start. If we go back to the guide, and the second thing that is in here is the criteria assumptions. So in this case, let's look at the New Zealand Apac criteria assumptions. So we just click on New Zealand Apac and click on Assumptions Template up here. And this will load up an Excel file with all the asset assumptions in our criteria. So this includes our base foreclosure frequency tables. It includes adjustments that we make to foreclosure frequency for non-residents, for investment properties, and a range of other adjustments. So this information is all here and readily accessible. So if we go back, next file we want to look at is the ResiGlobal data tape file. So this will open up the model for us to be able to populate and run. So let's double click on that. And now it's worth noting, when you download this ResiGlobal model, once you've saved it down and extracted it on your desktop, you don't need access to any special network. It's readily accessible in isolation. So when you load up the model, there's a license agreement. So let's click I agree. And this will load up the model wizard. Now, before we proceed with the model, we need to populate a data tape, as the model requires data to be presented in a very specific format. So before we get into the wizard, if you go into your add-ins tab, you'll see a Fitch ResiGlobal data tape button, and we want to click Create Template. And this will bring up a drop-down where you can select the relevant jurisdiction that you're looking to run the model for. In this case, let's select Australia APAC, and we'll hit OK. So this will load up a template for your pool cut to be run through the model. Now, when you've loaded this up, you can save this down like any normal Excel file. It can be accessed and edited without the model. So you can save this down, close the model, make changes, and then when you're ready to run it, come back and open up the model. You don't need to have the model installed in order to be able to edit or look at it. So there's a range of fields to be populated in here, and you'll see that there's a little bit of color coding. So any of the fields with a title in red are required or mandatory fields. The model will not run if these fields have not been populated. The fields with black text, like this CLVR override column, are optional, and you can run the model without populating them. In certain cases, the model will make calculations for you, and in others, they're just not required, and so they'll be left blank. The other thing to note is there are several columns with blue highlight above them. These fields show the data format that the model is looking for. So this loan type column is looking for you to identify whether a loan is conforming or non-conforming. And note that when it has a title and then a number in brackets, the model is looking for the number rather than the title or the wording. So just bear that in mind. Note that in some cases, this is not an exhaustive list. So if we look at the location one drop down, you can see we've got a range of numbers here starting in the 800s. This is to indicate that the model is looking for a postcode. However, it's not given an exhaustive list, it's just a guide. So you don't need to select numbers from this list. Also in Australia, there are a couple of fields that are not required or not used. First example of which is the province field. You can see that the drop down here is blank, so that can be left empty. And so is the property size field. That does not need to be filled in and it won't be used. Now, I mentioned earlier that in some cases where the model has an optional field and data is not provided, it will make assumptions for you. So an example of that would be for non-resident. If the field is not filled in, the model will assume that you're entering no data. And in the case of non-residents in our criteria, where there's no data, they're treated as being a resident. In some other cases, if we were to look at employment status, for example, we've got three options here. We've got employed/PAYG, we've got self-employed, and then we've got no data. Now, if you select no data or you leave the field blank, the model will actually make an assumption about whether the loan is self-employed or not. And that's done in line with the criteria, and it will depend on the composition of the pool, how that is applied. Similarly, the model will also override and apply adjustments for you to save you some calculations. An example of that is in the loan purpose column. So we've got a few options here. Most notable are the investment property and owner-occupied fields. So under Fitch's criteria, where a borrower has more than one property, we will treat that borrower or that property as an investment property. You can populate this field as owner-occupied or investment property or whatever the status is, and the model will check if the borrower has multiple properties, and if they do, it will override and apply investment property. So you don't need to make adjustments in order to fit our criteria. A couple of other things to note. An optional field here is current LVR and scheduled LVR. These are provided as overrides. So the model is designed for you to populate a borrower or a loan's individual property information. The model will use this information to sum up the security value and then calculate an LVR for you. However, there are some instances where you will need to populate this override as there's additional information that the model cannot know or utilize in its calculations. A couple of examples of that are where you have more than 5 properties. So the model only has fields of 5 properties. If a borrower has more than 5 properties, you'll need to calculate the LVR for it. A second example is if a borrower has an additional exposure to a loan outside of this pool cut, and where a cross-default clause applies. Again, that's additional information that the model cannot know, and so we will need to override the LVR calculation. There are also a couple of fields in here that require a little bit of analytical judgment. The first of which is the loan type field, whether a loan is conforming or non-conforming. It's worth noting that Fitch's criteria discusses the classification of conforming and non-conforming borrowers. The approach is detailed in the criteria, but generally speaking, Fitch applies a product-based approach where we will take into account an issuer's classification of the borrower, whether they're conforming or non-conforming, the types of borrowers that are eligible for a loan product, whether they can have defaults, whether they are allowed a short time of self-employed history, whether they're allowed bankruptcies, and how that product has performed compared to the market. And we will make a judgment based on those factors. So just bear that in mind when you're classifying loans. The second is reporting. Arrears day reporting can vary from issuer to issuer. And the thing to note here is that Fitch treats borrowers who are in hardship as being over 3 months in arrears. if that is not reflected in your pull cut, then that's a manual adjustment that you would need to make. So let's move on to how we populate this. So I populated a pool ahead of time. Let's load that up. Okay, so I'll just go through a few key fields to note here. First of all, we've got the pull cut date. This will always need to be populated in order for the model to know when the pull cut date is, so it can work out indexation. Also important to note that borrower identifier is a key field for Fitch, as the LVRs that we use are based on the obligor level. So if a borrower, if they have multiple loans, needs to have the same borrower identifier in order for the model to be able to correctly sum up their exposures and calculate their LVR. Another thing to note is that the model is able to accept negative current balances. So if a borrower has multiple loans and one or more of those loans have a negative balance, the model will offset those against the borrower's other loans, and it can do that automatically for you. However, it does not do that for scheduled balance. So if you have a negative scheduled balance, then you will need to floor it or make an adjustment. The next thing to note here is property identifier. This is an important field, again, for the model to be able to understand a borrower's exposure, their security, to calculate their LVR. If your or an issuer's data does not have a property identifier, then you may look to create a unique identifier by combining several fields like the obligor ID, code, the property type, valuation date, or any other combination of fields. So again, there are 5 property fields for you to fill in where relevant. On annual salary, just to note here that Fitch is looking for the gross annual salary of all borrowers on the loan in order for the model to be able to do its DTI calculations. And it's not in use here, but just to add that there are 3 optional other fields here where if you had a loan that needed an additional adjustment applied that's not covered by the fields previously, so increasing the foreclosure frequency by 5% for a given reason, for example, you can identify in here, flag the loan, and when we run the model, you can tell the model to make an adjustment for loans that have been flagged. So let's run this through the model. So let's close that. And we have the model open already. So this is back to the home screen. So let's click begin. The first thing it's going to want to do is find your data tape that you've populated. So we've got demo pullcut 1 v1 here. Let's hit OK. Now it'll ask you where you want your default file repository to be. So this is where the model will save down the files when you run them. You can change this if you'd like, or if you leave it as the default, it'll save files into a file within that ResiGlobal file that you extracted. We'll just leave this as the default, hit OK. So this will take a second just to load the data tape in. By default, it'll name the deal as the file name. We can leave that as is. And there's also a pull cut date here and a arranger name here, but those fields are not required. You can leave those as the default values. So we've got the data file here. Let's hit next step. So this will run a validation of the pool to check if there are any values that are unusual or not acceptable to the model. So you can get 2 results here. The first is an error, and the second is a warning. Errors need to be resolved in order to progress through the modeling, whereas warnings, if you acknowledge them and are okay proceeding without changing them, you can continue without making changes. So in this case, the model is telling us that in the scheduled balance field, we have a value that's too small. It's at 0 or below 0, and there's 1 loan affected. So if we want to quickly find out where that error is, you can click Fix Selected, and that'll load up your pull cut for you, and it'll tell you what error you're looking at, and it'll find the error for you. So it's loaded up this 1 loan, which has a scheduled balance of -1,000. Again, the model does not accept scheduled balances of 0 or below 0. So we'll need to fix that in order to progress the modeling. Now you can make a change here, but general best practice is to go back to your original pull cut and make the change there, save it, and then run it again, because that will allow you to reproduce your results consistently if you needed to run the model again in the future. So let's close this. And before we move on, let's also look at the annual salary. So if we click Fix Selected, Here we've got a couple of loans with no annual salary listed. In this case, the model will assume that there is no income data provided, and it'll make an adjustment. And then for these two loans, the annual salary is extremely low, and it's just letting you know that it is extremely low because that's unusual. So if we're okay with this, then we're able to acknowledge it without making changes. However, before we do that, we need to fix our schedule balance. If we go back a step, we remove the file, we go in and we make our changes. I've done that already, so we've got B2. So let's load that up. So I just floored that value at $0.01 or 1 cent, because that's the minimum value that the model will accept. So we've got our second file loaded. Let's hit next step. Again, it's going to run that validation. Okay, so we don't have an error anymore. We still have this annual salary warning, but we're okay with those values. So you can click select all warnings, acknowledge. And you're able to add a note here if you want to. You can access this later if need be. So you can just say, or you can leave it blank. You can say, okay, with salaries checked, and hit OK. And that'll clear the screen. And when this screen is clear, we're able to hit next step. Okay, so next step, there's a second layer of validation done here to check that the lookup values that we've used. So in the case of a non-conforming or conforming loan, we've used 1s or 2s rather than saying prime or conforming loan or anything else. So the data field here that it says we've got an issue with is issuer for Lmi QA, and it's got a lookup error, and that's in every single row. So if we go back to our data tape here, let's have a look at what it's found. So the issue for Lmi QA field is the field where you select the loan originator, and this will apply quality adjustment for the LMI when giving credit to LMI, depending on the level of credit or the QA score of a particular issuer. There's a list of issuers in here, and if you're running this model for an issuer that's not in this list, then you'll need to select a proxy. So selecting an originator that's similar to the one that you're running the model for. And we'll call that V3. All right, that's saved. So from here, we want to go back a couple of steps, remove our data tape, and we want to load up the version 3 that we just saved down. However, before we do that, I do want to show you some additional capability that the model has to assign aliases to unrecognized lookup values rather than having to go through and manually change them ourselves. So let me load that up quickly. Okay, so if we look at the validation errors here, we can see that there's an additional one here. We have the issue for Lmi QA, as we did before, and I've also mapped in an additional one for employment status where I changed the values from 1s and 2s to employee and SE for employee or PAYG and self-employed loans. Rather than going into the data tape and manually changing those all over, we can use the model's alias function to do it for us. So if we go to issue for Lmi QA, go edit alias, and we can see the unrecognized value here. So we have Fitch, and we get a list of expected values that we can map it to. So let's map it to ANZ. We want to click add to aliases allowed, and then we can see we have a known alias here for Fitch. So if we save that, and then we can save these alias settings for future use. So if we click save, and we'll save this as Fitch to ANZ, that's saved. And then we also want to do the same thing for employment status. So let's click edit alias, and we can see we've got two unrecognized values here. We've got SE or self-employed. So let's map that to self-employed, add to aliases allowed. And then if we click employee, we want to map that to employed PAYG. And then save that. And then again, I'll save this. So Fitch to ANZ and self-employed. And the good thing about aliases is that if your data is consistent between different pools, You can use these alias settings in future or for additional pools later without having to go through the process of manually mapping them. So if we click Load Alias Settings, let's go back to the original one that we saved, so Fitch to ANZ. It says loaded. Give that a quick second. And we can see that now we've got a lookup error for the employment status because the settings that we saved here were before we made that change. So if you're running through a new pool, we had the same mapping. We could go load alias, Fitch to ANZ and self-employed. So let's click load for that one. It'll quickly go through and map all those for you. And then we've got lookup validation passed. So this is a really handy way to be able to model multiple pools if your data is going to be consistent between them. And if you want to access your alias settings or files, if we go back to our ResiGlobal folder, we go to the save, you can see that we've got Fitch to ANZ and Fitch to ANZ SE, so you could copy and paste these, I guess, between computers or users if you were to run them somewhere else. So if we go back a couple of steps, let's remove that and we'll add our version 3. However, I've got a final version here where I've unmasked the postcodes, so we're going to use that, but it's unchanged apart from that from version 3. And then if we move through the steps, we should have all the validations passed. Lookup validation passed. Next step. And then we want to click certified data. Again, you can leave this blank or add any kind of comment that you want to for future reference. And when you click certified data, the model will format the pool cache in a file that is able to be processed by the model. So that's certified. And if you need to go back and make changes, you can click undo certify, but let's click open model. And this is where we get to, we've now completed the pool cache. It's in a format that is acceptable to the model. Now we need to actually run it through. This will just take a second. And when you click open model, what's actually happening is you're switching from the data tape file to the model. So the model uses the formatted pool that we've just created. Now that we've created this file, when we certified it, it will generate this RMBS file. And if you needed to rerun the model with this pool that you know is suitable and checked, you're able to go straight into the ResiGlobal model and load up this RMBS file, and that will skip over those steps of validating and checking that everything is in order. There we go. It is running a little bit slow with the screen recording. So when you get this ResiGlobal model screen, you can see at the top here that we're in the ResiGlobal model now. You'll get a high-level summary of some of the pool stratifications. We can move forward. So let's hit next step. We can skip this screen. This is just going to tell you what assumptions the model will make if it's got missing data for some of those optional fields. So for example, if you don't populate the LMI provider, it's going to select no LMI. If you leave non-resident blank, it will treat it as being not disclosed or not available. So if we click on next step and go to the next tab, we've got a button here that says edit assumptions. So we want to click on that, and this will open up in a familiar Excel format. And in this spreadsheet, we're able to adjust the assumptions that we're making for our model. So things like the bank bill swap rate, we can change LMI provider ratings, and we can make some of the either loan by loan ad hoc adjustments, or we can make foreclosure frequency adjustment for the whole portfolio. Okay, here we go. So as mentioned, this spreadsheet is where we can make adjustments for the model. The main one that we're always going to want to look at and change is the index spot rate. By default, this is set at 0.005. So we want to change this to 0.01, put it in as percent. And when you make a change in here, it'll prompt you and say, do you want to save it? And we need to hit yes, otherwise it will revert back to the original value. And we can see that that's been changed there. So the other fields that we may look at changing in here are the originator adjustment. So if we're making an adjustment for an originator whose products or loans are out of line with the market, we can make an adjustment, say adding 5%. I'll click no, but we can make that adjustment there. If we make any of those other 1, 2, or 3 adjustments in the pool and we flag those loans, this is where we can set the adjustment for those loans. So if a loan is flagged for a particular reason, we can then increase its foreclosure frequency by, say, 10%, 1.1 times. Again, I'll hit no. And then the portfolio level adjustments are applied to the whole portfolio. If we want to increase the foreclosure frequency for the whole transaction, I'll put that in here. So let's say that we wanted to increase the whole foreclosure frequency by 5%. We go 1.05, said yes. And then we need to tell the model what proportion of the pool this is relevant to. So we're applying it to the whole portfolio. So let's put in a 1, 100%. If this applied to, say, half of the portfolio, but the loans aren't specifically marked or identifiable, we could change this to, say, 50%, and then it'll scale this adjustment, but apply it to the whole portfolio. Further down, we have the Lmi Provider Ratings. So if you wanted to stress it by decreasing the Lmi provider's ratings, you can do that in here. Or if you want to look at different scenarios where an Lmi provider's ratings were to be upgraded to a certain level, we can make adjustments in here. Note that any of the gray fields are not editable. If you're going to make an adjustment, you're going to be focusing on this top section where we have these white fields that are editable. So when you're done, click back into the model, and you'll see that our changes have stuck. So you can see that the index spot rate was edited. You can see that the adjustment factor was edited from 0 to 1.05, and we set it to 1 to cover the whole portfolio balance. And then we can save these settings for use later if we want to. And then we can name the file. I'll just leave it as the default name there. Save it, and then if you were to come and run this model or a different pool again and you wanted to use the exact same settings, we can click on the settings button here, load saved settings, and then find your settings file. When we're done with that, let's hit next step. All right, so we've loaded our pool cut, we've made our assumptions, or set our assumptions. Now let's run it. Great. Okay, so the model's run, and it'll give you a little summary of the results here. But what we really want to look at is this report, which will include a detailed breakdown of the results, plus some stratifications and some additional information and about how the model has interpreted and adjusted for the pool. And this is the final step. Okay, the model report has finished loading. So we can go through this. The first thing to note is that similarly to the pool cuts template, this report can be saved down and viewed and edited like any other Excel file. It doesn't need to be accessed via the model, or you don't need to have the model installed or saved down in order to access it. So let's just save it down. And then, like I said, this report will be accessible at any time. Just to summarize some of the key spots in this report, the first thing you'll see on this front page is a summary of the portfolio's foreclosure frequency, recovery rate, and portfolio loss, both with credit to LMI, without credit to LMI. And that's provided a full range of ratings from B up to AAA. We have our foreclosure frequencies, recovery rates, and then our portfolio losses. Also on this page, a couple of tail risk tests. So the second one is for revolving transactions only. Probably won't cover that one, but the first one is the large loan concentration test, and that will show you what the concentration test result is for each of the different rating levels based on the largest loans in the pool. So on the next tab, we have adjustments, and this is a really useful tab, similar to the assumptions file that we looked at right at the start of the video. But this page will show you some select stratifications and the adjustments that the criteria makes for a given loan characteristic. And it'll show you what percentage of the pool is being adjusted. So for example, we can see here that the pool has 0.2% non-resident loans. The adjustment for non-resident loans is 1.5 times. So you can see that that is applied to those loans, and then we get a weighted average adjustment based on this stratification, which in this case is a small one, so 1.001 times. But you can see this for each of the stratifications listed here. So if we were to look at investment properties, for example, again, we've got 22% investment properties. These have an adjustment of 1.25 times. This pool is adjusted, the foreclosure frequency is adjusted by 1.055 times based on the split of investment properties versus owner-occupied. And then at the top here, we can also see a weighted average total adjustment. So this can be useful to compare two pools together to see how these individual loan or borrower characteristics are driving your end result. Do note that this is an adjustment, however. So this is an adjustment made to the base foreclosure frequency of the pool, and we can see, or we can get a better idea of what the base foreclosure frequency is if we go into the next tab, the distribution tab, and we can see this base foreclosure frequency table. Through this, we determine the base foreclosure frequency, and then we apply each of these adjustments to that to get a weighted average. And by looking at these two fields, or these two sections of the results in particular, you can get a good idea of what is driving your final results. At the top of the adjustments tab as well, you can also see if we make any of those, again, individual loan or portfolio-wide adjustments, we can see those in here. So we ended up making a 1.05 times adjustment. It was applied to the whole portfolio, and we can see the final adjustment from this section up here. So that it provides a neat summary of basically all the adjustments that have been applied to the pool. The next tab, the distribution tab, is essentially a breakdown of some of the pool stratifications. So I'll let you know the LMI coverage, different providers, the distribution of the LVRs, and several other stratifications, the property type, whether it's staff loans, and a few others in here. The next tab is an amortization profile, which the model's generated. The amortization profile of the portfolio. The next one is the criteria assumptions file. Again, this is similar to the file that we looked at right at the start. This is all the assumptions for the Australian Apac criteria, or the assumptions for the model. And where we've made changes, those will show up on the overrides. So we can see that we changed the index spot rate. The original value was 0.005, and we changed it to 0.0001. So that makes it really quick and easy to see what assumptions were changed or set for the model. The next few tabs list any of the warnings that we had. So we had that annual salary warning affected 4 loans, and we made a comment, we're okay with it, and we checked it. We didn't use any aliases. This will list some of the fields where there was missing data. So for example, property size, we didn't populate because it's not required, and the assumed value is 0. So that is a quick run through of the ResiGlobal model. Again, this output file can be saved down and accessed without needing to have the model open or to have it on your computer. So it's readily accessible at any time. I hope that helps give you an understanding of how the model works, how to run it, and how to interpret the results. And we encourage you to download it, give it a try. Thank you.